The guards patrolling the Obsidian complex thought the worst thing they'd face that morning was the aftermath of a massive sandstorm. They were wrong. The Haboob had buried the city's most expensive zip code in choking orange grit, turning pristine white marble into a dirty wasteland. But as the wind died down at 5 a.m., the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. The storm had erased the boundaries between the sky and the sea, but inside Villa Number 4, a much darker line had been crossed. What waited behind those closed doors would shatter the illusion of a perfect paradise and reveal that even the highest walls can't keep out the consequences of a deadly obsession. Viktor Volkov, a private security contractor who had spent 10 years in zones of conflict before taking the quiet money of the Almarjan elite, drove his electric patrol cart slowly down the main avenue. His tires crunched softly over the fresh sand, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the vacuum of the morning. Victor hated the morning shift. It was the time when the complex was most vulnerable, suspended between the debauchery of the night before and the business of the day ahead. Usually, the Obsidian was a ghost town at dawn. The residents, a collection of heirs, oil magnates, and shadow brokers, typically slept until noon, recovering behind blackout curtains from lives of excess that the rest of the city was never allowed to see. Victor checked his dashboard. The sensors were still recalibrating after the static charge of the storm, blinking with intermittent error messages. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for storm damage. A shattered skylight, a toppled statue, a gate forced open by the wind. In his line of work, you learned that the wealthy didn't like surprises, and they paid men like Victor to ensure that their world remained predictable, even when the weather refused to cooperate. He turned the corner onto the private drive of the Seafront Row, the most expensive real estate in the entire district. Here, the villas weren't just homes. They were compounds, massive brutalist structures of concrete and glass that turned their backs to the street and opened entirely to the private beach. He slowed the cart as he approached Villa Number 4. Villa 4 belonged to Jaber al-Qasimi. In the unwritten hierarchy of the Almarjan coast, Jaber was a titan. He wasn't just a man who owned property. He was a man who owned leverage. He was a figure who moved through the Onyx district, the flashing, neon-lit heart of the city's nightlife, with the casual, terrifying confidence of someone who had never been told no without destroying the person who said it. Jaber was known to the security team not for his generosity, but for his volatility. He was a man of sudden, violent silences and cold, calculated rage. The standing order for Villa 4 was simple: do not approach unless summoned. Do not look unless told to see. But Victor stopped the cart. He didn't have a choice. The massive front door of Villa 4, a 12-foot slab of solid teak wood imported from a rainforest halfway across the world, was ajar. It wasn't wide open, just cracked enough to break the seal. In a place like the Obsidian complex, an inch is a mile. These homes were designed to be hermetically sealed biomes, fortresses of climate control that kept the perfect, chilled air inside and the humid, gritty reality outside. An open door after a sandstorm wasn't just an oversight, it was a breach. Victor sat in the idling cart for a long moment, staring at the gap in the wood. The dust collected on the threshold showed no footprints entering or leaving. The silence from the villa was absolute. He keyed his radio, the device feeling heavy and slippery in his gloved hand. "Dispatch, this is Patrol 1. I have an unsecured entry at Villa 4. No visual on the resident. No movement. Requesting protocols." The radio crackled with static, the storm's interference still ghosting through the frequency. "Copy, Patrol 1. Proceed with extreme caution. Client status is dormant. Do not disturb unless you have cause. Confirm breach." "Confirming breach," Victor muttered, stepping out of the cart. Door is unlatched. Security panel is dark. He unholstered his heavy-duty flashlight, though the sky was already lightening to a bruised purple above the ocean. He walked up the marble steps, his boots leaving the first marks in the virgin sand. He didn't draw his weapon. These weren't the kind of clients you pulled guns on, but his hand hovered near his belt. His instinct, honed in places far more dangerous than a luxury beach resort, was screaming at him. The air around the villa felt wrong, felt static. He reached out and pushed the heavy wood. The door swung open silently on well-oiled, invisible hinges. The first thing that hit him was the cold. The air conditioning inside the villa was running at full industrial capacity, set to a temperature that felt more like a morgue than a living space. It cut through the muggy warmth of the morning instantly, raising goosebumps on Victor's arms. It was a dry, artificial cold that seemed to freeze the moisture in his nose. The second thing was the smell. It wasn't the metallic, copper scent of blood. Violence in the Obsidian complex rarely smelled like a street brawl. It was more sophisticated, more cloying. The air in the foyer was thick with a complex, nauseating perfume. It was the smell of stale, high-grade oud, the heavy, resinous scent that Jaber wore like armor, mingled with the sharp, chemical tang of spilled alcohol. But underneath the luxury scents, there was something else, something biological, the faint, sweet-sour odor of sickness, of a body that had stopped fighting. "Mr. Al-Qasimi?" Victor called out. His voice echoed in the cavernous entryway, bouncing off the polished limestone floors and the abstract art that hung on the walls like trophies. "Security." We found the door open. There was no answer, no movement, just the low, constant hum of the air conditioning vents pushing freezing air into the room. Victor stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The foyer opened up into a massive open-concept living area that spanned the entire width of the house. The back wall was entirely glass, looking out over the private infinity pool and the gray, churning sea beyond. The curtains, usually drawn tight against the morning sun, were wide open. The gray light of dawn flooded the room, casting long, spectral shadows across the furniture. The room was a monument to modern excess. Low-slung Italian leather sofas, tables made of petrified wood, sculptures of chrome and glass that looked dangerous to touch. The aftermath of a party was evident, but it wasn't the usual chaotic debris of the Onyx district after hours. It was strangely orderly. A spilled tray of hors d'oeuvres, a shattered crystal glass near the bar, a rug kicked up in the corner. It looked less like a party and more like a stage set where the actors had suddenly vanished. Victor moved deeper into the room, his boots squeaking on the marble. He swept the light across the bar area, the kitchen, the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Nothing. Then he turned his beam toward the sea-facing window. In the center of the room, positioned to look directly out at the turbulent water, was a high-backed designer armchair made of distressed cognac leather. From the back, all Victor could see was a hand resting on the armrest. The hand was still, too still. Victor walked around the chair, his breath hitching in his throat. Sheikh Jaber Al-Qasimi was sitting in the chair. He wasn't slumped over. He wasn't sprawled in the indignity of death. He looked almost peaceful, his head tipped back against the leather, his eyes half open and fixed on the horizon line where the gray sea met the gray sky. He was wearing a silk dressing gown over a crisp white dress shirt, the top buttons undone. But the piece was an illusion. Even in the dim light, Victor could see the unnatural color of his skin. It was cyanotic, a deep, terrifying blue-gray that started at his lips and spread to his fingertips. His face was frozen in a mask of mild confusion, his mouth slightly open as if he were about to ask a question that he had forgotten halfway through. On the side table next to him sat a crystal tumbler, half full of amber liquid. The ice had melted hours ago, leaving a ring of condensation on the wood. Victor checked for a pulse, though he knew it was a formality. The skin was cold, not just air-conditioned cold, but the deep, absolute cold of a fire that has gone out. Rigor mortis hadn't fully set in yet, but Jaber was gone. The titan of the Al-Marjan coast, the man who bought debt and sold fear, was nothing more than 200 pounds of cooling biological matter. Victor straightened up, reaching for his radio to call in the code black, the code for a resident death. But before he could press the button, a movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. He wasn't alone in the room. Sitting on the floor, in the far corner where the glass wall met the stone pillar, was a woman. She was so still, so blended into the shadows, that Victor had missed her entirely. It was Raha. Victor knew Raha. Everyone in the security detail knew Raha, though they pretended not to. She was the invisible woman, the Filipina girl who had started as a server at the underground parties, and had suddenly been elevated to the position of companion. In the eyes of the staff, she was a ghost, someone who moved silently through the service corridors, head down, eyes averted. They knew her as the girl who wasn't allowed to leave the complex without an escort, the girl whose passport was locked in Jaber's safe. But the woman sitting on the floor didn't look like a ghost. Raha was wearing a white dress. It was an evening gown, something structured and architectural, made of silk that shimmered in the dawn light. It was the kind of dress that cost more than Victor made in a year. but it was the jewelry that held Victor's gaze. Around her neck was a diamond collar so heavy it looked like it would bruise her collarbone. Matching cuffs encircled her wrists. In the gray light, the stones didn't sparkle. They looked like ice. They looked like shackles. She was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her legs. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was staring out the window, past Jaber's body, past the pool, watching the waves crash against the seawall. Her face was completely devoid of expression. It wasn't shock exactly. It was a terrifying, terminal lucidity. It was the look of someone who had walked through a fire and realized that burning didn't hurt as much as they thought it would. "Ma'am," Victor said, his voice dropping to a gentle, cautious register. He treated her the way one treats a bomb that hasn't gone off yet. "Raha." She didn't blink. She didn't turn her head. She just continued to watch the sea. Did you call anyone?" Victor asked, taking a step toward her. "Do you need medical attention?" Raha slowly turned her head. Her eyes were dark, dilated, and impossibly calm. She looked at Victor, then she looked at Jaber's body in the chair, then back to Victor. There was no panic in her gaze. There was no guilt. There was only a profound, empty exhaustion. "No," she said. Her voice was a whisper, but it was steady. It didn't waver. "I didn't call anyone." Victor looked at the glass on the table. He looked at the blue tint of Jaber's lips. He looked at the diamonds on Raha's wrists. The scene wasn't a crime scene in the traditional sense. There was no blood. There was no struggle. The furniture wasn't overturned. It was clean. It was sterile. "Ma'am," Victor said, his hand hovering over his radio again. "I need to call the police. You need to tell me what happened here. Was there an accident?" Raha uncurled her legs. She stood up, the silk dress rustling softly like dry leaves. She didn't move to run. She didn't move to hide. She walked over to the small side table where Jaber's laptop sat closed. Next to the laptop was a stack of papers. They were wrinkled, as if they had been gripped tightly, then smoothed out. Victor stepped closer, shining his light on the papers. They weren't love letters. They weren't suicide notes. They were financial documents, bank transfers, mortgage deeds, loan acquisitions, a spreadsheet printed on high-gloss paper, with rows and rows of numbers highlighted in green. Raha placed her hand on the papers. Her diamond bracelet clicked against the mahogany table. "He was celebrating," Raha said, her voice floating in the cold air. "He paid a lot of money for tonight." "Celebrating what?" Victor asked, confused. Raha looked at Jaber's corpse with a detachment that chilled Victor more than the air conditioning. "The acquisition," she said. "He bought a farm in Laguna. He bought a house in San Isidro. He bought a life." She paused, tilting her head as if listening to a sound only she could hear. "He thought he bought me." Victor stared at her. The pieces of the puzzle hadn't landed yet, but the picture was forming. The open door, the lack of an alarm, the drink, the silence. "I'm going to call the authorities now, Raha," Victor said, backing away slowly, putting distance between himself and the woman in the white dress. You stay right there." "I'm not going anywhere," Raha replied. She turned back to the window, watching the sun finally breach the dust haze, casting a blood-red light across the water. "I'm already home." As Victor retreated to the foyer to make the call that would shatter the morning silence of the Al Marjan coast, he took one last look at the scene. The dead billionaire in the chair, the girl in the diamonds by the window, and the spreadsheet on the table. The police report that would be filed later that day would call it a domestic incident, a crime of passion, a tragic overdose. The headlines would scream about the scandal of the sheikh and the server. But those who saw the spreadsheet, those who saw the calm in Raha's eyes, would know the truth. It wasn't passion. Passion is messy. Passion is loud. This was quiet. This was calculated. This wasn't a murder. It was a liquidation of assets. It was the closing of a deal. The storm outside had cleared, scrubbing the world clean, leaving behind a silence that felt final. And in that silence, Raha waited for the sirens, not as a prisoner, but as the only free person in the room. Welcome to the Al Marjan coast, where the sand covers everything eventually, and where the price of freedom is always printed in the fine print. To understand how we ended up here, with a body in a chair and a bride in handcuffs, we have to go back. We have to go underground. We have to go to the vault. Because before the diamonds, before the spreadsheet, and before the storm, there was just a girl mixing drinks in the dark, and a man who thought that everything in the world had a price tag. But he forgot the one rule of the market that even billionaires cannot escape. Sometimes the cost of ownership is higher than the price of purchase. Sometimes the asset is toxic. This is the story of the gilded cage. And the morning of silence was just the sound of the lock finally breaking. To understand the silence of the villa on that Thursday morning, we have to understand the noise that preceded it. We have to rewind the clock 8 months, rewinding past the storm, past the marriage contract, and past the murder, to a basement located 3 stories beneath the pavement of the Onyx District. If the Al Marjan Coast was where the elite slept, the Onyx District was where they sinned. It was a grid of neon and black glass, a fictional playground of high-end retail by day and underground vice by night. In a city that prided itself on public propriety and strict moral codes, the Onyx District was the pressure valve. It was the open secret, and deep within the bowels of a legitimate, unassuming luxury car dealership lay the vault. The vault wasn't a place you found on Google Maps. It didn't have a sign. It didn't have a front door. Entry required a biometric scan and a referral from a member who had spent at least $500,000 in the district in the last fiscal year. It was a speakeasy designed for men who had everything but wanted the one thing their status couldn't legally buy them: chaos. The air inside the vault was pressurized, recycled, and thick with a specific cocktail of scents: imported Cuban tobacco, spilled champagne, sweat, and desperation. The bass from the sound system didn't just thump, it vibrated in your bone marrow. It was a place of shadowy corners and velvet booths, where deals were made that would never appear on a boardroom agenda. And standing behind the bar, invisible in plain sight, was Raha. Raha was 24 years old. She was part of the invisible army, the thousands of migrant workers who kept the machinery of the Al Marjan Coast oiled and running. They were the drivers, the nannies, the cleaners, and the bartenders. They existed in the peripheral vision of the elite, essential but ignored. Raha came from San Isidro, a fictional province of green rice paddies and unpaved roads thousands of miles away. In San Isidro, the soil was rich, but the people were poor. Her father was a tenant farmer on land he didn't own, working a debt that seemed to grow like a weed, choking out every harvest. Raha wasn't just working for herself. She was the economic engine of an entire clan. Every drink she mixed, every insult she swallowed, every hour she stood in heels on the sticky concrete floor translated into bags of fertilizer, school tuition for her brother, and insulin for her mother. She was a server, a euphemism that covered a dozen different indignities. In the vault, her job was to be decorative and efficient. She wore the uniform, a black cocktail dress that was just short enough to be provocative but long enough to be legal, and she had mastered the art of the service smile. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a mask she put on like makeup to protect the person underneath. March 12th, a Tuesday. Tuesdays were slow in the Onyx District, which meant the clientele was different. The weekend tourists were gone, leaving only the serious players. The men who didn't need a weekend to destroy themselves. That was the night Jaber Al-Qasimi walked in. He didn't enter like the others. Most men in the vault announced their arrival with noise, loud greetings, snapping fingers at the staff, ordering bottles with sparklers attached to them. They wanted to be seen. Jaber entered like a drop of ink falling into clear water. He was silent. He was solitary. He wore a bespoke suit, charcoal gray, cut so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. He bypassed the VIP tables near the dance floor and took a seat at the far end of the bar, the darkest corner of the room. Raha noticed him immediately. In the service industry, you develop a sixth sense for danger. There are different kinds of dangerous men. There are the drunks who are clumsy and loud. There are the aggressors who touch without asking. But Jaber was the third kind, the inspector. He didn't look at the room, he scanned it. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and devoid of warmth. He watched the room the way a hawk watches a field, looking for movement, looking for weakness. When Raha approached him, wiping down the mahogany counter, he didn't look at her chest or her legs. He looked at her hands. "Water," he said. His voice was low, a baritone that cut through the ambient techno music. "Still, no ice." Raha nodded, relieved. "Of course, sir." She poured the water from a crystal decanter. Her hand shook slightly, fatigue or maybe the weight of his gaze. A single drop spilled onto the polished wood. She froze, expecting the reprimand. The men in the vault were notorious for their temper tantrums over minor inconveniences. Jaber didn't yell. He reached out a hand, manicured and heavy with a platinum signet ring, and placed a napkin over the spill. He held her gaze. "You look tired," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. "It is a long shift, sir," Raha replied, keeping her eyes lowered. "Protocol dictated you never engaged in personal conversation unless invited." "How long?" 12 hours, sir." Jaber took a sip of the water. He placed the glass down without making a sound. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a money clip. He peeled off a single bill. $500. He slid it across the wet napkin. "For the water," he said. Raha stared at the money. $500 was 2 months of medication for her mother. It was half the harvest debt. It was a fortune sitting in a puddle of condensation. "Sir, the water is free," she stammered. "Nothing is free," Jaber replied, standing up. He adjusted his cuffs. "Go home. Sleep." He walked out without finishing the glass. That was the beginning. The hook wasn't romance. It was relief. Jaber didn't court her with flowers or poetry. He courted her with solutions. He identified the primary stressor in her life, financial scarcity, and he began to systematically remove it. He returned the next night, and the next. He never drank alcohol, only water or espresso. He sat in her section, effectively blocking other customers from approaching her. He became a shield. He asked questions, not about her dreams or her hobbies, but about her reality. "How much is your rent? How much does your brother's school cost? Who is your landlord?" Raha, exhausted and lonely in a city that treated her like a utility, mistook this interrogation for care. She opened up. She told him about the farm in San Isidro. She told him about the damp walls of the staff dormitory where she slept on a bunk bed with 3 other women. She told him about the fear that kept her awake at night, the fear that the money transfer app would crash, or the exchange rate would drop and her family would starve. 3 weeks after they met, Jaber made his move. He waited for her shift to end at 4 a.m. When Raha exited the service door into the humid alleyway, usually bracing herself for the long bus ride back to the dorms, a black SUV was waiting. The window rolled down. Jaber was in the back seat. "Get in," he said. "I'll drive you." Raha hesitated. She knew the stories. She knew what happened to girls who got into cars with powerful men. But she also knew what was in her pocket, an eviction notice for her parents' farm. She got in. The interior of the car smelled of leather and the same expensive oud that would later scent the air of his death chamber. It was quiet, safe. "I have an apartment in the Onyx district," Jaber said, looking straight ahead as the driver navigated the empty streets. "It is empty. My investment property. It has a view of the sea. It has a kitchen. It has a lock on the door." He turned to look at her then. "You will live there. No rent. You will quit this job at the bar. I do not like other men looking at you." "I can't quit," Raha whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I need the money for my family." "I will take care of the money," Jaber said. He said it casually, like he was offering to pay for lunch. "You are too valuable to be mixing drinks for idiots." Raha looked at him. In the darkness of the car, he didn't look like a predator. He looked like a savior. He looked like an exit door in a burning building. She didn't see the cage being built. She only saw the walls that protected her from the wind. She said yes. The move was swift. Raha left the dormitory with 1 suitcase. She moved into the apartment on the 40th floor of the Black Pearl Tower. It was a stark, modern space of white marble and chrome. It was beautiful and it was cold. This is where the psychological pivot, the grooming phase, truly began. It wasn't violent. It was insidious. It was the golden handcuffs. For the first 2 months, life was a dream. Raha slept for 12 hours a day. She ate fresh food. She swam in the building's private pool. Jaber visited 3 times a week. He was possessive, yes, but generous. He bought her clothes, not the clothes she liked, but the clothes he wanted to see her in. Elegant, understated, expensive. He was molding her. But with the luxury came the isolation. "Why do you need to see those girls from the dorm?" Jaber asked one evening when Raha mentioned meeting a friend for coffee. He was cutting a steak, his knife moving with surgical precision. "They are jealous of you, Raha. They will try to drag you back down. You are not like them anymore. You are with me." So, she stopped calling them. She stopped going to the Filipino market. She stopped speaking Tagalog. Her world shrank until it was just the apartment, the view of the sea, and Jaber. But the true lock on the cage clicked shut on the day of the remittance. It was the first of the month. Raha was stressed, trying to navigate a banking app on her new phone to send her allowance to San Isidro. The Wi-Fi was spotting. The transaction kept failing. She was pacing the living room, biting her nails. Jaber was watching her from the sofa. He set down his espresso. "Give me the phone," he said. "It's okay. I can do it, it's just the signal," Raha said, flustered. "Raha," he said. His voice dropped an octave. The command voice, "Give me the phone." She handed it to him. He looked at the screen. He looked at the amount. He scoffed. "The fees are ridiculous, and the exchange rate is criminal. You are losing 20% of the value." He placed the phone on the table face down. "I will handle it," Jaber said. He pulled out his own laptop, the same laptop that would later sit on the table next to his corpse. He opened a spreadsheet. "Give me your father's bank details. Give me the routing number for the farm's mortgage holder." Jaber, "No, that is too much, I can't." "I am not asking," he said calmly. He began typing. "I will set up a direct transfer from my holding company. It is cleaner. No fees, and I will double the amount. Your father needs a new tractor, doesn't he? And your mother needs the specialist in the capital." Raha stood frozen in the center of the living room. To refuse him felt ungrateful. He was offering to change her family's destiny with a few keystrokes. But deep down in the reptilian part of her brain, an alarm was ringing. If he pays the mortgage directly, he holds the deed. If he sends the money, he controls the supply line. "Thank you," she whispered. Jaber hit enter. The screen flashed green. "Done," he said. He closed the laptop and looked at her with a smile that was terrifyingly possessive. "Now you don't have to worry about anything. You don't have to think about money. You just have to think about me." This was the transaction. It wasn't a gift. It was a purchase. In that moment, Raha ceased to be a girlfriend or a mistress. She became an asset, a line item in Jaber's ledger. He had bought her loyalty by holding her family hostage with kindness. He stood up and walked over to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. His grip was firm, heavy. "You are mine now," he murmured into her hair. "We are a team. No secrets. No outside noise. Just us." Raha leaned into him, closing her eyes. She felt safe. But safety is just a feeling. Security is a fact. And the fact was, she had just handed over the only leverage she had, her independence. The apartment was silent, high above the noise of the Onyx district. But if Raha had listened closely, she would have heard the sound of the heavy steel door of the trap slamming shut. She was no longer a server in the vault. She was the treasure inside it. And Jaber Al-Qasimi never lost the combination to his own safe. But even the best security systems have a flaw, a glitch. And Jaber's glitch was coming. He assumed that because he had bought her debts, he had bought her heart. He assumed that Raha, the poor girl from San Isidro, would be content to be a bird in a gilded cage as long as the seed was expensive. He forgot that birds have wings. And he forgot that before she was his asset, she was a human being. 6 months later, that humanity would walk into her life in the form of a beat-up Toyota and a boy named Mateo. And the spreadsheet that Jaber had just so confidently filled out would become the death warrant for a love story that hadn't even begun yet. This is where the tragedy truly starts. Not with a scream, but with a submit button on a banking website. 6 months. That is how long it takes for a dream to curdle into a hallucination. By September, Raha had everything she had ever prayed for in the humid nights of the staff dormitory. She lived in a climate-controlled fortress of glass and steel. She wore silk that felt like water against her skin. She had a driver, a limitless credit card for approved expenses, and a view of the ocean that tourists paid thousands of dollars to glimpse for a weekend. But the human mind is not designed for a cage, no matter how much gold leaf you apply to the bars. Jaber's control was absolute, but it was invisible. He didn't lock the doors. He simply monitored the keycard logs. He didn't ban her from going out. He just required a security escort for her safety. He didn't forbid her from speaking to her family. He just sat in the room while she did, listening to the tone of her voice, filtering her reality through his presence. Raha was suffocating. She was drowning in dry air. She missed the smell of rain. She missed the sound of laughter that wasn't polite or transactional. She missed the chaotic, messy noise of her own language. And then the glitch happened. It happened on a Tuesday, the same day of the week she had met Jaber. The universe, it seems, has a sense of irony. Jaber was away on business in Zurich for 48 hours, a rare window of unsupervised time. He had left strict instructions for the security detail, but the regular driver called in sick. A substitute was sent from the agency. A man who didn't know the rules. A man who didn't know that Raha was a bird that wasn't allowed to fly. I want to go to the Souk Almina, Raha told the new driver. It was a test. The Souk was the old market, the beating heart of the city's migrant workforce. It was loud, dirty, and distinctly not part of the Onyx district. The driver shrugged. Okay, ma'am. Stepping out of the car at the Souk Almina was like stepping into a color photograph after living in a black and white movie. The air smelled of frying oil, turmeric, diesel, and roasted corn. It was the smell of life. Raha walked through the crowded alleys, her expensive designer sunglasses hiding her eyes, her luxury handbag held tight against her chest. She looked out of place, a diamond dropped in the dust. She stopped at a small stall selling mangoes, the small, sweet yellow kind from home. Magano pa? How much? She asked, the Tagalog feeling strange and heavy on her tongue after months of speaking only English. 5 dinars for the box, miss, a voice answered. But it wasn't the vendor. She turned around. Leaning against a beat-up white Toyota Corolla, eating a skewer of grilled meat, was Mateo. Mateo was 26. He had the calloused hands of a mechanic and the smile of a boy who hadn't let the city break him yet. He was wearing a faded polo shirt with a company logo on it. He was a driver for a construction firm. He wasn't handsome in the way Jaber was. He didn't look like a statue. He looked like earth. He looked like warmth. You're overpaying, Mateo said, grinning. He stepped forward and rattled off a rapid-fire negotiation with the vendor in Arabic that was broken but effective. He got the price down to 2 dinars. He handed Raha the mangoes. You have to be careful. They see the sunglasses. They see the bag. They think you are a walking ATM. Raha laughed. It was a rusty, jagged sound. She hadn't laughed in 6 months. I'm Raha, she said. I'm Mateo, he replied. And you look like you're lost. I am, Raha said. And for the first time in half a year, she was telling the truth. That 48-hour window turned into a secret life. When Jaber returned, Raha had changed. She had remembered who she was. For the next 4 weeks, the glitch expanded. Raha learned the blind spots in Jaber's surveillance. She learned that the security shift changed at 3 p.m., leaving a 15-minute gap at the service gate. She learned that Jaber's obsession with control made him arrogant. He never suspected she would dare to defy him, so he stopped looking as closely. She met Mateo in the parking lots of shopping malls. They sat in his beat-up Toyota with the broken air conditioning, eating takeout rice and talking. It wasn't just an affair. It was a reclamation of humanity. With Jaber, Raha was an object. She was polished, displayed, and used. With Mateo, she was Raha. They talked about San Isidro. They talked about the harvest festivals. Mateo showed her pictures of his nephews. He held her hand, not like he owned it, but like he was afraid he might break it. He treats you like a doll, Mateo said one afternoon. Tracing the bruising on her wrist from the heavy diamond cuff Jaber insisted she wear. He treats me like an investment, Raha corrected him. It's different. Leave him, Mateo said. The words hung in the hot air of the car. I have savings, not much, but enough for 2 tickets. We can go back. We can go home. Home. The word tasted like fresh water. Raha looked at Mateo, poor, kind, brave Mateo, and made a choice. She chose poverty over the cage. She chose the dirt road over the marble floor. I have to tell him, Raha said. I have to end it properly. If I just run, he will find me. He has reach. But if I explain, if I tell him I am homesick, that I am not cut out for this life, maybe he will just let me go. To him, I am just an accessory. You don't chase a lost earring. You just buy a new one. It was the single greatest miscalculation of her life. She thought she was dealing with a man who had an ego. She didn't realize she was dealing with a man who had a ledger. October 10th. The Al Marjan Chalet. The setting sun was casting long, bloody shadows across the living room floor. Jaber was sitting on the white leather sofa, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. He was in a good mood. He had just closed a deal on a commercial tower in the capital. Raha stood in the center of the room. She had rehearsed this speech 1,000 times in the shower. She kept her hands clasped in front of her to stop them from shaking. "Jaber," she started, her voice thin. He looked up, smiling. It was a terrifying smile because it didn't reach his eyes. "You are standing very far away, Raha. Come sit. I need to talk to you," she said, staying rooted to the spot. I have been thinking about my family, about home." Jaber took a sip of water. He didn't speak. He just waited. The silence was a weapon. "I am not happy here," Raha rushed on, the words tumbling out. "You have been so generous. You have given me everything. But I miss my life. I miss the farm. I think I need to go back. I think we should end this." She held her breath, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the shouting, the throwing of glass, the violence she had seen him inflict on business rivals over the phone. But Jaber didn't shout. He didn't even frown. He set his glass down on the coaster. He sighed, a sound of mild disappointment, like a parent whose child has failed a simple math test. "You want to go home?" Jaber repeated flatly. "Yes," Raha whispered. I am just a simple girl, Jaber. I don't belong in this world. You deserve someone who fits here." Jaber stood up. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket. He walked over to the dining table where his laptop sat closed. "I understand," he said. "Homesickness is a powerful emotion. Irrational but powerful." He opened the laptop. The screen glowed blue in the dim room. "Come here, Raha," he said. His voice was gentle. "I want to show you something before you pack." Raha walked toward him, confused. Was he going to show her a flight itinerary? Was he going to buy her a ticket? Hope, cruel and bright, flared in her chest. Jaber turned the laptop around. It wasn't a travel website. It was Microsoft Excel. "Do you recognize these figures?" Jaber asked, pointing to a column of numbers highlighted in green. Raha squinted. She saw dates. She saw amounts. And then she saw names. The air left the room. Raha felt her knees turn to water. She gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. "What is this?" she gasped. "I told you I would handle the transfers," Jaber said. He sounded bored. "And I did. But I didn't just pay your bills, Raha. I bought the debt." He tapped a key. A new window opened. It was a scanned document, a deed of sale for her family's farm. The signature at the bottom belonged to her father. "Your father was very happy to sign," Jaber explained, walking around the table to stand behind her. "He thinks I am a benevolent benefactor. He thinks I am his son-in-law. He sold me the land for pennies on the dollar because I promised to let him work it for free, as long as we were together." He leaned in close. Raha could smell his cologne, oud and cold ambition. He leaned in close. Raha could smell his cologne, oud and cold ambition. "I own the farm, Raha. I own the tractor. I own the house your sister lives in. I own the debt for your brother's surgery." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "If you leave," he whispered into her ear, "I call in the debt, all of it. Tomorrow morning, I evict your parents. I seize the land. I stop the payments to the hospital. Your father will die in the street, and it will be your fault." Raha couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. The generosity of the last 6 months hadn't been kindness. It had been a purchase order. He hadn't been saving her family. He had been buying leverage. "And this," Jaber continued, his voice hardening. He tapped the screen again. A blurry photo appeared. It was taken from a distance, through a telephoto lens. It was a picture of Raha sitting in a beat-up Toyota Corolla, holding hands with Mateo. Raha let out a strangled sob. "The driver," Jaber laughed softly. "Really, Raha? You want to trade a palace for a Corolla? You want to trade a king for a servant?" He slammed the laptop shut. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "You don't have a boyfriend," Jaber said, his voice dropping the pretense of gentleness. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were dead, black sharks swimming in calm water. "You have a husband. We just haven't signed the papers yet." He released her face, wiping his hand on a handkerchief as if her tears had soiled him. "The lawyer is coming tomorrow with the contracts. You will sign the marriage license, and you will sign the non-disclosure agreement." He walked toward the door, stopping just before he exited. If you try to run, Raha, if you try to contact this boy again, I won't just take the farm. I will burn it down, and I will make sure there is no one left to harvest the ashes. He walked out, leaving Raha standing in the darkening living room. The view of the ocean was black now. The glass walls didn't look like windows anymore. They looked like the walls of an aquarium. She looked at the laptop. She looked at her hands. She had thought she was a girlfriend. She had thought she was a lover. But as the realization crashed over her, she understood the terrifying truth of her existence. She was a line item. She was collateral. And in the spreadsheet of Jaber Al-Qasimi, there was no column for exit. There was only owned. But Jaber had made a mistake, a critical error in his calculation. He assumed that despair would make her obedient. He didn't realize that when you take away everything a person has to lose, you don't make them safe. You make them dangerous. Raha wiped her face. She didn't go to bed. She went to the window and looked out at the gathering clouds. A storm was coming, a haboob. And somewhere in the city, Mateo was waiting for a text that would never come. The glitch was fixed. The system was reset. But the virus was already inside. November 13th, 11 p.m. The Al Marjan coast. The meteorological term is a haboob, an intense dust storm carried on an atmospheric gravity current. But to the residents of the Onyx district, it looked like the end of the world. The sky, usually a canvas of deep, velvety indigo, had turned a sickly, bruised orange. The wind wasn't blowing, it was screaming. It tore through the manicured palm avenues at 60 miles per hour, stripping the fronds and turning the millions of grains of sand on the private beaches into microscopic projectiles. Inside Villa Number 4, the silence was absolute, but the pressure was dropping. The barometer on the wall was falling, and so was Raha's capacity for rational thought. Jaber had gone to his study to take a call with his investors in Zurich. He had left his laptop open on the table, a deliberate taunt. The green rows of the spreadsheet glowed in the darkened room, a digital ledger of her slavery. On. Raha stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass. The world outside had vanished. The streetlights were swallowed by the swirling wall of dust. The security cameras, usually blinking their red, rhythmic eyes, were obscured by the opacity of the storm. Panic is a biological response, but desperation is a calculation. Raha looked at the storm, and she didn't see danger. She saw cover. She reached into the lining of her handbag and pulled out the burner phone Mateo had given her, a cheap plastic brick that felt heavier than the diamond bracelet on her wrist. She went to the bathroom, turned on the shower to mask the sound of her typing, and sent a single text. Now, the storm blinds the cameras. Southgate. 10 minutes. She didn't wait for a reply. She couldn't. She stripped off the silk evening gown Jaber had made her wear for dinner. She pulled on a pair of black leggings and a dark hoodie, clothes she had hidden at the back of the closet, relics from a life she was no longer supposed to have. She didn't pack a bag. You don't pack luggage when you are running from a burning building. You just run. Raha stepped out of the bathroom. The hallway was empty. The air conditioning hummed, indifferent to her terror. She moved like a ghost, bypassing the main foyer and heading for the service entrance in the kitchen. She opened the door, and the storm hit her like a physical blow. The wind knocked the breath out of her lungs. The sand was everywhere instantly. In her eyes, her mouth, her nose, felt like being scrubbed with sandpaper. The noise was deafening, a roaring cacophony that drowned out the sound of her own heartbeat. But there was a dark miracle in the chaos. Visibility was zero. The immaculate perimeter of the obsidian complex, usually a fortress of surveillance, was blind. Raha ran. She ran through the garden, stumbling over uprooted landscaping. She climbed the low wall that separated the villa from the service road. The sand stung her skin, drawing blood on her cheeks, but she didn't feel it. She only felt the terrifying, electric hope of the exit. The south gate was a service exit, usually unmanned at night, secured only by a magnetic lock and a camera. Tonight, the camera lens was plastered with red grit. Raha reached the gate. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the keycard, stolen from the housekeeper 3 weeks ago, into the sand. She fell to her knees, clawing at the dirt, screaming a silent scream into the wind. Her fingers brushed plastic. She grabbed it, swiped it. The light turned green. The gate clicked. She pushed it open and stumbled out onto the public coastal road. And there, Idling in the howling orange dark was the white Toyota Corolla. It looked like a chariot. It was battered, the paint scoured by the wind, rocking violently on its suspension as the gale buffeted it. Mateo was inside. Raha threw the door open and collapsed into the passenger seat. The interior smelled of stale coffee and fear. Raha! Mateo screamed over the wind, grabbing her arm. His face was pale, his eyes wide. Are you hurt? Drive! Raha choked out, coughing up sand. Just drive, Mateo. Go! Mateo didn't hesitate. He slammed the car into gear. The tires spun on the slick, sandy asphalt, finding traction, and the car shot forward. For 3 minutes, they were free. 3 minutes, 180 seconds. That was the duration of their rebellion. They drove blindly into the maw of the storm, the headlights reflecting off the wall of dust, creating a hypnotic, terrifying tunnel of light. Raha gripped Mateo's hand. She was crying, but she was smiling. They were doing it. They were out. The spreadsheet couldn't reach them here. The debt couldn't catch a Toyota doing 80 kilometers an hour in a hurricane. We go to the embassy, Mateo shouted, his eyes fixed on the invisible road. We tell them everything. They will protect us. Yes, Raha sobbed. Yes. Then the world turned white. It wasn't the storm. It was high-intensity floodlights cutting through the dust like lasers. Ahead of them, appearing out of the orange void like monsters emerging from the deep ocean, were 2 massive black SUVs. They were parked horizontally across the road, creating a barricade of steel and light. Mateo slammed on the brakes. The Toyota skidded, fishtailing violently on the sand, spinning 180 degrees before coming to a shuddering halt. Reverse! Raha screamed. Go back! Mateo shifted gears, but it was too late. Behind them, a third SUV had emerged from the storm, boxing them in. They were trapped in a cage of light and dust. The doors of the SUVs opened. Men spilled out. These weren't the resort security guards in their polite uniforms. These were Jaber's personal detail, private military contractors, mercenaries who were paid not to ask questions. They wore tactical gear and balaclavas to protect against the sand. They moved with the terrifying efficiency of a wolf pack. Lock the doors! Mateo yelled, hitting the central lock. It was a futile gesture, a plastic button against a tire iron. The first mercenary reached the driver's side window. He didn't knock. He swung a heavy baton, shattering the glass in an explosion of safety crystals. The wind roared into the car, bringing the violence with it. Mateo tried to fight. He was a mechanic, strong from years of manual labor, but he wasn't a soldier. He threw a punch, but the mercenary caught his arm, twisted it, and dragged him through the broken window like a rag doll. No! Mateo! Raha screamed, clawing at the door handle. Her door was ripped open. Hands, rough, gloved hands, grabbed her by the hair and the hoodie. She was hauled out of the car and thrown onto the asphalt. The pavement was hot and abrasive. She looked up, spitting blood and sand. The mercenaries had dragged Mateo to the center of the road, illuminated by the headlights of the SUVs. They held him down, his face pressed into the grit. Then, the rear door of the lead SUV opened. Jaber Al-Qasimi stepped out. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was wearing a pristine white thobe and a protective eyewear. He looked immaculate, untouched by the chaos, an emperor surveying a battlefield he had already won. He walked slowly, fighting the wind, until he stood over Raha. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. I told you, Jaber said. His voice was calm, but the wind carried it to her ears with chilling clarity. I told you there is no exit. He looked at the mercenaries holding Mateo. He nodded. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution of spirit. Jaber stepped forward. He didn't let his men do the work this time. He wanted Raha to see. He wanted her to understand the physics of power. He kicked Mateo in the ribs. The sound of the bone cracking was a sharp, wet snap that cut through the howling wind. Mateo curled into a ball, gasping for air that was too thick with dust to breathe. Stop! Raha shrieked, trying to scramble toward them. A guard planted a boot in the center of her back, pinning her to the ground. Please, Jaber, stop! Jaber ignored her. He kicked Mateo again. In the stomach, in the thigh. It was methodical. He was dismantling a machine. Mateo wasn't moving anymore. He was lying in a pool of his own blood, which turned to black mud as it mixed with the sand. Jaber signaled the guards to step back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handgun. It was a small, sleek silver pistol. A gentleman's weapon. He walked over to Mateo and pressed the barrel against the boy's temple. Mateo's eyes were swollen shut. He was wheezing, a horrible rattling sound bubbling from his chest. Jaber looked at Raha. "This is the balance sheet," Jaber said. He had to shout over the storm, but his face remained impassive. "You created a deficit, Raha. A debt of loyalty. Now we must balance the books." He cocked the hammer of the gun. The click was louder than the storm. "No!" Raha screamed. "I'll do anything. Please don't kill him. I'll do anything." Jaber paused. He tilted his head, as if considering a counteroffer. "Anything? Anything?" Raha sobbed, her face pressed into the asphalt. "I'll come back. I won't run. Just let him go. Please." Jaber looked down at Mateo, then back at Raha. "You don't just come back," Jaber said cold. "You come back as my wife. Tonight. You sign the papers. You smile. You never mention the farm or the debt or this boy ever again. You belong to me. Completely. Irrevocably." He pressed the gun harder into Mateo's skin. "Or," Jaber continued, "I pull this trigger, and then I call the police and tell them I shot an intruder who was kidnapping my fiancée. The storm will hide the evidence. Who do you think they will believe? The sheik? Or the dead driver?" Raha looked at Mateo. He was barely conscious. If she said no, he died. If she said yes, she died. Not her body, but her soul. She would be buried in the marble tomb of Villa Number 4 forever. It wasn't a choice. It was a transaction. "Yes," Raha whispered, then louder, screaming it into the wind. "Yes, I will marry you. Just stop." Jaber smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just acquired a rare asset at a steep discount. He uncocked the gun. He stepped back. "Good decision," he said. He gestured to the mercenaries. "Leave him." "But he's hurt," Raha cried. "He needs a hospital." "If he is strong, he will walk," Jaber said, turning his back on the broken boy. "If he is weak, the sand will bury him. It is not your concern anymore." 2 guards hoisted Raha off the ground. She tried to look back at Mateo, but they shoved her into the back of Jaber's SUV. The leather was soft. The air was still. It smelled of oud. As the car door slammed shut, sealing out the noise of the storm, Raha looked through the tinted rear window. She saw the taillights illuminate the road one last time. She saw a lump in the road, rapidly being covered by the drifting orange sand. Mateo was moving, just a twitch of a hand, but he was fading. He was being erased by the desert. Jaber sat beside her. He didn't look at her. He took out a handkerchief and wiped a speck of dust from his watch. "Fix your hair," he said, staring straight ahead as the driver turned the car back toward the Obsidian complex. "We have guests coming to celebrate. You need to look like a bride." Raha sat in the darkness. Her hands were numb. Her heart was beating, but it felt mechanical, a pump pushing fluid through a machine. The sandstorm raged outside, battering the windows, trying to get in. But the real storm was over. The chaos was gone. Order had been restored. The asset had been recovered. The debt had been leveraged. And as the SUV passed through the gates of the complex, the heavy iron bars closing behind them, Raha realized the truth. She hadn't just signed a marriage contract. She had signed a death certificate. The only question left was whose name would be on it. The transition from the chaotic, screaming wind of the coastline to the interior of Villa Number 4 was jarring. It was like stepping out of a war zone and directly into a museum. The heavy teak door clicked shut, sealing the vacuum. The silence was instant. The air was still, filtered, and scented with white tea and cedar. Raha stood in the foyer, shivering. She was still wearing the black hoodie and leggings, now caked in a layer of orange mud. Her hair was matted with grit. Her face was scraped raw where the asphalt had bitten into her skin. She looked like a survivor of a natural disaster, standing on Italian marble that cost more than her village made in a decade. Jaber didn't look at her. He walked past her to the console table, checking his reflection in the gilded mirror. He adjusted his collar. He brushed a speck of imaginary dust from his shoulder. He was already rewriting the narrative in his head. The violence on the road hadn't happened. Mateo didn't exist. The only thing that mattered was the schedule. "Go upstairs," Jaber said, his voice flat and administrative. "Shower. Scrub the filth off. You have 20 minutes. Jaber, Raha croaked. Her throat felt like it was filled with glass. He turned. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was boredom. It was the look a man gives a malfunctioning appliance. The lawyer is in the study, he said. He has been waiting for an hour. Do not make him wait longer. And Raha, he pointed a manicured finger at the floor. Do not bleed on the carpet. Raha walked up the floating staircase. Her legs felt heavy, disconnected from her body. It was the shock setting in, the physiological crash after the adrenaline of the escape attempt. She entered the master bathroom, a cavern of white stone and chrome. She turned on the shower, making the water as hot as she could stand. She didn't just wash. She scoured. She used a loofah to scrub the orange sand from her skin until she was red and raw. She was trying to wash off the memory of the road. She was trying to wash off the feeling of Mateo's hand being ripped from hers. But the water ran clear, and the memory remained. When she stepped out, wrapped in a plush towel, a garment bag was hanging on the door hook. Jaber had chosen it. It was a white dress, a floor-length gown of heavy silk crepe with a high neck and long sleeves. It was modest, architectural, and unmistakably bridal. But it wasn't a dress for a celebration. It was a dress for a coronation, or a sacrifice. Raha put it on. The silk was cool against her heated skin. Fit perfectly. Of course it did. Jaber knew her measurements better than he knew her heart. She walked downstairs. Jaber was waiting in the study with a man Raha had never seen before. The lawyer was small, gray, and carried the unmistakable aura of a man who made his living burying the sins of the wealthy. He didn't look up when Raha entered. He just organized the papers on the mahogany desk. Standard prenuptial agreement, the lawyer droned, sliding a document toward her. Waiver of rights to the Al-Qasimi estate. Confidentiality clause with a $10 million breach penalty. And the marriage contract itself. Civil registration. Jaber handed her a pen. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy, black resin. Sign, he said. Raha looked at the paper. The words swam before her eyes. Party A, Jaber Al-Qasimi. Party B, Raha Cruz. She thought of the spreadsheet. She thought of her father's farm. She thought of Mateo lying in the road, the sand burying his broken legs. She signed. The pen scratched against the paper, a harsh, dry sound in the quiet room. She signed her name once, twice, 5 times. With every signature, she felt a door locking inside her mind. She was sealing herself in. She was finalizing the purchase. Done, the lawyer said, gathering the papers efficiently. He didn't offer congratulations. He put the documents in his briefcase, nodded to Jaber, and left. Jaber picked up the contract. He looked at it with satisfaction, then placed it in the safe behind his desk. He spun the dial. There, he said, turning to her with a smile that chilled her blood. That wasn't so hard, was it? Now you are safe. Now you are provided for. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. And now, he said, you look the part. He opened the box. Inside lay the diamond set, a collar of white gold and emerald-cut diamonds that looked heavy enough to crush a windpipe. Matching cuffs. He walked behind her. Raha stood paralyzed, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. She watched Jaber's hands come around her neck. The metal was freezing. He clasped the latch. Clicked. A sharp, mechanical sound. Beautiful, he whispered. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the diamonds. He was admiring his property. My friends are here, Jaber said, checking his watch. Smile, Raha. You are the lady of the house now. The celebration was a small, intimate affair in the main living room. The storm was still raging outside, battering the glass walls, but inside, the atmosphere was one of insulated privilege. 3 men sat on the leather sofas. They were Jaber's inner circle business partners, fellow investors in the Al Marjan dream. There was Tariq, a real estate developer with a smile like a shark. Omar, a silent man who owned a fleet of shipping tankers. And Walid, the youngest, who laughed too loud and stared at Raha with open, predatory curiosity. They were drinking Blue Label whiskey. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and testosterone. To the acquisition, Walid toasted, raising his glass as Jaber entered with Raha on his arm. To the merger, Tariq corrected, winking. Jaber beamed. He was high, not just on life but chemically. Raha noticed the dilated pupils, the rapid jaw movement, the sheen of sweat on his forehead. He had been visiting the bathroom frequently. "Gentlemen," Jaber announced, presenting Raha like a prize heifer at an auction. "My wife." The men clapped. It was a slow, lazy applause. They looked her up and down, assessing the merchandise. They knew who she was. They knew she was the bartender from the vault. They knew she was the help. But now she was wearing Jaber's diamonds, so they treated her with a mock deference that was more insulting than cruelty. "Charmed," Omar grunted. Raha sat on the edge of the sofa next to Jaber. He draped his arm around her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh. He pulled her close, marking his territory. "She is shy," Jaber said, pouring himself another drink. His hand was shaking slightly. The energy was buzzing off him. "It has been an emotional day. The storm, you know." "The storm is brutal," Walid laughed, chopping a line of white powder on the glass coffee table. "I saw a car overturned on the coastal road. Some old Toyota. Buried in the drift. Poor bastard probably didn't make it." Raha stopped breathing. Car overturned. Buried. Jaber felt her stiffen. He squeezed her shoulder hard. A warning. "Careful on the roads," Jaber said smoothly, reaching for the rolled-up bill Walid offered him. "The desert takes what it wants." He leaned forward and snorted the line. He threw his head back, inhaling sharply. The Captagon hit him instantly. His eyes widened. He looked invincible. Raha felt a nausea rising in her throat that had nothing to do with the alcohol she hadn't touched. She was sitting next to the man who had ordered the hit, listening to his friends joke about the wreckage. They were monsters. No, they were worse. They were businessmen. To them, Matteo wasn't a human being. He was debris. "I need." Raha stood up. Her legs were trembling. "I need to use the restroom." Jaber looked at her. The drugs made his gaze intense, manic. "Hurry back," he said, his hand lingering on her wrist before letting go. "We haven't cut the cake." The men laughed. Raha walked out of the living room. She kept her back straight. She walked with the glide Jaber had taught her. But inside, she was screaming. She entered the guest bathroom on the ground floor. She locked the door. She collapsed against the sink, gripping the cold porcelain until her knuckles turned white. She looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't Raha. The woman in the mirror was a stranger in a white dress and a diamond collar. Her eyes were hollow. "Dead. He is buried." The voice in her head whispered. "Matteo is buried. You are buried." She looked at the door. She couldn't run. The guards were outside. The storm was outside. She looked at the medicine cabinet. Jaber used this bathroom when he was entertaining. It was his private stash. She opened the mirrored door. It was a pharmacy of vice. There were bottles of prescription painkillers, sleeping pills for the nights the conscience or the caffeine wouldn't let him rest. And there, on the bottom shelf, was a small plastic bag filled with small, yellowish pills. Captagon. The poor man's cocaine. The soldier's courage. The drug that kept fighters awake for days in war zones. It was a powerful amphetamine. It made your heart race. It made you feel like a god. Next to it was a bottle of heavy-duty sedative. Benzodiazepines. The label read, "Take one for sleep. Do not operate heavy machinery." Raha stared at the bottles. She wasn't a chemist, but she was a bartender. She knew about mixing. She knew about the speedball. She knew what happened when you mixed a massive dose of uppers with a massive dose of downers. The heart doesn't know whether to sprint or stop. The signals get crossed. The electrical system shorts out, causes cardiac arrest. And in a man Jaber's age who had been drinking whiskey and snorting lines all night, it would look like a tragic, hedonistic accident. Raha reached out. Her hand didn't shake. The fear was gone. The grief was gone. In their place was a cold, hard clarity. Jaber had taught her that everything was a transaction. He had bought her life. He had bought her family. He had tried to buy her soul. But contracts can be terminated. If the principal account holder is deceased, she thought, the legal jargon flowing through her mind like a prayer, the assets are frozen. The debt collection stops. The leverage disappears. She grabbed the bag of Captagon. She grabbed the bottle of sedatives. She opened the bag. She took a heavy crystal glass from the shelf. She placed 10 of the Captagon pills in the bottom. She used the handle of a toothbrush to crush them into a fine, yellow dust. Then, she opened the sedative bottle. She took 5 capsules, pulled them apart, and dumped the white powder into the mix. yellow and white, energy and sleep, life and death. She turned on the tap and added a splash of warm water, swirling it until the powder dissolved into a cloudy, bitter paste. She looked at her reflection one last time. "You don't have a husband," she whispered to the mirror, repeating Jaber's words back to herself. "You have a target." She wiped a smudge of mascara from under her eye. She pinched her cheeks to bring back the color. She unlocked the door. She walked back out into the hallway, moving toward the bar. The sound of the men's laughter drifted down the corridor. They were celebrating their power. They were celebrating their ownership of the world. Raha walked to the wet bar in the living room alcove. Jaber's crystal tumbler was sitting there, empty, waiting for a refill. "Raha!" Jaber called out from the sofa. He was sweating profusely now, his tie loosened. "Where is my whiskey? A groom should not have an empty glass." "Coming, Habibi," Raha said. Her voice was sweet, smooth. She picked up the bottle of Blue Label. She poured a generous measure into the tumbler. Then, shielding the glass with her body, she poured the slurry from the bathroom cup into the whiskey. She swirled it. The expensive amber liquid clouded for a second, then cleared. She walked toward the sofa. The storm outside hammered against the glass, a drum roll for the final act. Raha held the glass out. The diamonds on her wrist caught the light, flashing like warning beacons. Jaber looked up at her. He smiled. He saw a broken woman. He saw a subdued wife. He saw an asset that had finally been brought to heel. He reached out. His fingers brushed hers. "To us," Jaber said. "To us," Raha replied. He brought the glass to his lips. This was the wedding. This was the consummation. Not with a kiss but with a sip. Raha watched him drink. She watched him swallow the poison she had mixed with the same hands he had put in cuffs. And for the first time all night, amidst the storm and the smoke and the ruins of her life, Raha felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt like the one in control. 3:14 a.m. The Al Marjan coast. The storm had finally exhausted itself. The wind, which had spent the last 6 hours tearing at the foundations of the obsidian complex, dropped to a low, mournful whistle. Inside Villa Number 4, the silence returned, creeping back into the corners of the room like rising water. The guests were gone. Tariq, Omar, and Walid had stumbled out to their waiting limousines 20 minutes earlier, leaving behind a trail of cigar ash and empty promises. They had clapped Jaber on the back, made crude jokes about the wedding night, and vanished into the night, oblivious to the fact that they were the last people who would ever see him alive. Jaber was alone with his bride. He sat in the cognac leather armchair facing the sea, the heavy crystal tumbler resting on his knee. He was sweating, a cold, slick sheen that coated his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. The Captagon was firing in his synapses, demanding action, demanding noise. But the alcohol and the fatigue were pulling him down, creating a jarring, electrical dissonance in his body. "Raha," he croaked. His voice was thick, slurring slightly. "Refill." Raha stood by the bar. She hadn't moved since the guests left. She watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat navigating a maze that had no exit. "You haven't finished the last one," she said softly. Jaber looked down at the glass. There was an inch of amber liquid left. The slurry of crushed amphetamines and sedatives had settled slightly at the bottom, a murky sediment in the expensive whiskey. He frowned, trying to focus his eyes. The room was swimming. The edges of the furniture seemed to be vibrating. "Drink it," he muttered to himself, lifting the glass. "Celebration." He tipped his head back and drained it. He swallowed the sediment. He swallowed the poison. Raha watched his throat work. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Jaber set the glass down on the side table with a heavy clunk. He leaned his head back against the leather, closing his eyes. He expected the rush. He expected the second wind that the white pills usually gave him. Instead, he felt a sledgehammer hit his chest. It started as a flutter, a bird trapped in his ribcage. Then it became a vice. The chemical war Raha had unleashed in his bloodstream was catastrophic. The Captagon was screaming at his heart to beat faster, to pump harder, to run a marathon. The benzodiazepines were screaming at his respiratory system to slow down, to relax, to stop. The biological confusion was lethal. His heart entered a chaotic, shuddering arrhythmia. "Raha!" Jaber gasped. His eyes flew open. They were wide, terrified, and confused. My chest. He tried to stand up. His brain sent the command to his legs, but the signal got lost in the static. His knees buckled. He collapsed back into the chair, his limbs feeling like they were filled with wet cement. I need, he wheezed, clutching at his dress shirt, popping a button. Doctor. Call. Security. Raha walked out from behind the bar. The silk dress rustled on the marble. A soft, whispering sound. She didn't walk to the phone. She didn't walk to the panic button on the wall. She walked to the window. No, she said. Jaber stared at her. The word didn't make sense. No one said no to Jaber Al-Qasimi. What? He managed to choke out. The blue tint was already starting to spread across his lips. The oxygen wasn't reaching his blood. Raha turned to face him. She stood framed by the darkness of the sea, the diamond collar glittering in the low light like the teeth of a trap. You bought the debt, Raha said. Her voice was calm, devoid of anger, devoid of fear. You put it all in the spreadsheet. Column A, column B. You balanced the books, Jaber. She took a step closer, stopping just out of his reach. But you forgot the transaction fee. Jaber's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. He was drowning in dry air. His hands scrambled across the side table, knocking over the empty glass. It rolled off and hit the floor, but didn't break. It just spun, a dizzying circle of sound. He reached for his laptop. If he could just open it, if he could just summon help. Raha reached out and gently closed the lid of the computer. The account is closed, she whispered. Jaber's vision was tunneling. The room was going dark. All he could see was the white dress and the diamonds, the assets he had purchased, the objects he had owned. He tried to speak one last time. He wanted to threaten her. He wanted to tell her he would burn the farm, burn the village, burn the world. But his vocal cords were paralyzed. All that came out was a wet, rattling exhale. His head lolled back against the chair, his eyes fixed on the horizon line where the sun was threatening to rise. The struggle stopped. The heart gave up. The ledger was balanced. Raha stood there for a long time. She watched the rise and fall of his chest slow down. Shallow, slower, slower, stop. Jaber Al-Qasimi, the titan of the Al-Marjan coast, was dead. He looked peaceful, almost asleep, except for the terrifying blue color of his skin. Raha didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She felt a profound, hollow lightness. The weight of the debt, the weight of the fear, the weight of the future. It all evaporated in the climate-controlled room. She walked over to the table. The spreadsheet was still there, the hard copy Jaber had printed out to taunt her. She picked it up. She folded it carefully, creasing the edges with her thumb. She placed it in the pocket of Jaber's dressing gown, right over his silent heart. A receipt for services rendered. Then, she sat down on the floor by the window. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs, just like she had done in the staff dormitory, just like she had done in the closet when she was hiding from him. She waited. She watched the sun come up. It turned the gray sea into a sheet of hammered copper. It illuminated the wreckage of the storm outside, the uprooted palms, the layers of sand. At 5:12 a.m., she heard the electric hum of the security cart outside. She didn't move. She heard the footsteps on the marble stairs. She heard the door squeak open. Mr. Al-Qasimi? It was Victor, the guard. Raha didn't turn around. She knew what would happen next. The sirens, the handcuffs, the questions, the cell. But it didn't matter, because in a hospital in the Philippines, a money transfer had already cleared. The mortgage was paid. The surgery was funded. And somewhere, under the drifting sand of a coastal road, a boy named Mateo had clawed his way to the surface, broken but breathing. Raha held out her hands, the diamond cuffs catching the first light of the morning sun. She was ready to pay the price. The trial of Raha Cruz was the shortest in the history of the Al-Marjan High Court. There was no denial, no plea bargain. She confessed to the administration of a lethal substance with the same calm efficiency she had once used to mix drinks in the vault. The prosecution called her a black widow. The defense called her a victim of economic coercion. The tabloids called her the diamond killer. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Carrara Women's Correctional Facility. But if you visit her today, you won't see a woman suffering. She works in the prison library. She reads. She sleeps 8 hours a night. She smiles, a real smile, not the service mask she wore for years, because she knows the truth that the court records omitted. Matteo survived. He was found by a passing truck driver 3 hours after the storm cleared. He lost the use of his left leg, but he returned to San Isidro. He works the farm now, the farm that Jaber Al-Qasimi paid for. Every month, Matteo sends a letter to the prison. It contains no words, just a photograph, picture of a harvest, picture of a new roof, a picture of a sunrise over a green field that belongs to no one but them. Jaber thought he could buy people. He thought the world was a marketplace where everything had a price tag. He was right. Everything does have a price. But he forgot to check the cost of the one thing he wanted most: control. Raha sits in her cell, and she is the freest woman in the world. She traded her life for theirs. It was a hostile takeover, a liquidation of assets, and in the end, Raha Cruz balanced the books perfectly.